The PlayStation Vita was released in Japan December 17th, 2011 and made its way to the rest of the world including Europe by February 22nd, 2012. So looking at it nearly 3 years later, is the PS Vita still a good games console, and was it really ever? Let's take a look. How's it going guys? Michael from Copper vs Glass, and today we're going to be taking a look back on the PlayStation Vita. I recently was able to pick one up for around £99 here in the UK, which I thought was a good deal until I started to buy some games and realised that there's not necessarily all that much in terms of AAA titles. So I'm going to be giving you guys my overall thoughts and opinions on the design and the hardware, and also going into some of the actual games themselves. Starting off with the design of the PS Vita, on the right hand side you've got the traditional D-pad, an analog stick, the PlayStation button which also acts as the home button, and also one of the dual front facing speakers. The design itself is extremely nice and it fits in really well with some of the older PlayStations like the PS3. On the right hand side you've got a secondary analog stick, triangle, square, circle and X buttons, a 0.3 megapixel front facing camera, start select, and also a secondary speaker because, as I mentioned before, it is actually stereo sound. Round the back of the device is where it gets interesting, as you've actually got a touch panel and another 0.3 megapixel camera. On the top of the device you're going to find the power button where you insert the actual games themselves, a port that really has no use, and also the volume controls. In terms of the cartridges themselves, unless you're downloading games to the very expensive Sony SD cards, they're going to come on these tiny cartridges. Now if you think you've seen the volume buttons before, you definitely have, as they're pretty much a carbon copy of old iPhones including the iPhone 4 and also the iPhone 5. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing as they are actually quite responsive. On the bottom of the device you're going to find a 3.5mm headphone jack and also the charger. Now if you're thinking that it's going to be a standard micro USB charger to make it very simple and very easy to charge, you are definitely wrong. What you're instead going to have is Sony's own charger that, as far as I can tell, can only be used on the PlayStation Vita, so don't go losing this as it may cost you a fair amount to get a new one. In terms of the internals of the Vita, you are going to find a 2200 mAh battery, which will give you around 3 to 5 hours for games, 5 hours of video, and around 9 hours worth of music. It's also got a 2GHz ARM Cortex-A9 processor, 512 megabytes of RAM, and also, as I mentioned, a 3.5mm headphone jack and stereo speakers, and also a microphone so it can pick up on chat for certain games. And to view those games, you're looking at a 5-inch 16:9 OLED panel on the older PlayStation Vita, or an LCD panel on the newer version. It's also multi-touch, which is definitely a great feature, as some games do have specific touch features, so it's good that the screen is nice and responsive. In terms of the resolution though, it's not necessarily the best. It only comes in at 960 by 554, which if you do the maths only gives a pixel density of 220 pixels per inch. So in terms of the screen itself, you're not really going to notice the pixels per inch as the games that you are playing. If you're playing quite a fast game like Wipeout as I am now, you're not really going to notice it, but if you are playing maybe a slower game or watching videos via YouTube or just in general using the web browser, you're definitely going to notice that the screen itself isn't necessarily that high resolution. Now you've heard me mention that there are different varieties of the PS Vita. Now there's the original, which I have, or the PCH 1000 as it's known, and also you can get the PCH 2000, which is basically the PS Vita Slim, and that definitely shows in the weight. So the one that I've got here, the original, comes in at 260 grams for the Wi-Fi model, 279 grams for the 3G, whereas the PS Vita Slim comes in at 219 grams, but is only available in the Wi-Fi configuration. The newer model as well is clocked slightly higher, so you may see a little bit better games performance, but overall you're not really going to see that big of a difference. Where you are going to see a difference though is in the screens. The original has an OLED panel, whereas the newer version has an LCD panel. Now with the OLED panel, it's basically kind of like what you get on a Samsung phone, so the blacks are very deep, it's got very high contrast, good viewing angles, and it's really great to view outside. Whereas the LCD panel, that one is maybe a little bit undersaturated, the contrast could be better, and also the viewing angles aren't necessarily that great if you are viewing it slightly off axis. But enough about hardware and specs, what about the actual games themselves? Well, for the last minute or so you've been watching me play Wipeout 2048, which is a very fast-paced racing game. Now, it is slightly different to original Wipeout games that you may have played on the PlayStation 1 or the PlayStation 2, but as you can see, the graphics do look incredible for what is essentially a handheld device. It runs at a very high frame rate, the colours, the graphics, and just in general the overall gameplay is extremely fluent. I've not had really any issues with stuttering. Now, there are some levels on here which are combat levels where you do have to fight your opponent, and again with that, certain particle effects and things can slow it down ever so slightly, but overall really solid performance from a game that in my opinion looks like it could have come from a Xbox 360 or maybe even a PlayStation 3. Now on to what many would consider one of the best looking games on the PlayStation Vita, Killzone Mercenaries. Now I've played this game from start to finish. It clocks in at around 4 to 5 hours, which isn't necessarily very long, but if you are playing on a handheld device, you don't necessarily want to be too engrossed in it, as you will be picking up and playing every now and then. This isn't necessarily a sit down and play console like an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4 or even PC games. But one thing that I would say is, again, with this the graphics look incredible, and also the analog sticks do a really good job. I used to own a PSP and the analog stick, if you can really call it that, was completely terrible. Whereas these are kind of maybe somewhere in between the PSP and the PlayStation 3 or 4, so they do have really nice travel and they do respond very well, but they could maybe be a little bit better when you do play certain games. For instance, like Killzone, you are going to have to tweak the controls slightly. But overall, the graphics, the gameplay, and also the sound coming from those front-facing speakers is incredibly well. And you can see also this game does take advantage of the touchscreen controls and also the back touch panel during certain sections of the game. The multiplayer in Killzone Mercenaries is also really good. Now there's not a ton of people playing, as maybe they've got bored, or as the PlayStation Vita is quite old, they may have moved on to better things, but if you can find a game with a lot of people in it, then it is definitely a great experience. There's a good leveling up system, customizing your loadouts, and again the graphics hold up very well even in multiplayer. Now I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it on the 3G version, and I still can't really tell why they've done a 3D model of the PS Vita, and I'm guessing that's why they scrapped it for the Slim, but if you've got a good Wi-Fi connection, you're definitely going to have some fun with the multiplayer on Killzone Mercenaries. Now on to the last game that I tested, and one that probably a lot of PlayStation Vita owners have, as it was kind of a release game at the time of the console being launched. That is Uncharted Golden Abyss. Now again, the graphics in this game look incredible. Now they're not up to the standards of the PlayStation 3, but they are maybe slightly under that, as the resolution isn't that great, but it's the gameplay that matters, and the gameplay of Uncharted, even on a PlayStation Vita, still holds up extremely well. You've got the really high quality cutscenes, the gameplay is incredible, and also the action and gunplay translates really well to this handheld with the slightly less responsive analog sticks that you would have on a normal DualShock controller. It also takes really good advantage of most of the features on the PlayStation Vita, so whether that's using the touchscreen to draw up a cliff as to where you want Drake to climb, or whether it's using the back touch panel to move up and down a rope or swing back and forth, it takes advantage of it really well. You can also zoom in using the top trigger on the left hand side, and you can then move the console around to make Drake aim around the actual game world itself. Now that can be a little bit disorientating, and it does mean that you can't really sit in one place, as you do have to move around, but you can, if you want, use the analog stick the traditional way. But overall, Uncharted is probably one of, if not the best game available on the Vita. Some may argue, obviously there are a lot of indie games available, and the games that I've tested here, these 3 games, are kind of more AAA titles and more kind of advanced than what you're going to be getting in the store from maybe some indie developers. But that in no way means that there are no good indie games on the PlayStation Vita. In fact, it's probably the best console to get a first try at some of these great indie games. Now there are a lot of RPGs and a lot of Japanese games as well that have been ported over to the PS Vita, which some may enjoy. I personally though am more of a fan of the kind of games that I would play on an Xbox or a PlayStation, hence why the ones that I've been showing you today are those kind of AAA titles. But if you do want a really good back catalogue of either original PlayStation games, PSP games, and also some really good indie games, then the PlayStation Vita is definitely a good deal. And if you can pick one up for around the £99 mark, or around that sort of price that I have, then you can't really go wrong. So back to the original question of, is the PS Vita a good games console? Now it's not going to replace an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4 or even some of the last generation consoles, but if you do want a solid games console with some really good games, then you definitely can't go wrong. The price of the PS Vita has come down, and also the indie games have really increased in both the quality and also the quantity on the PlayStation Store. Also, if you do want to get your hands on some of the more AAA games like Uncharted or Killzone, you can pick those up for around $9.99 in some of these second-hand game stores. They are still going to be quite expensive doing it through the PlayStation Store, but that doesn't mean that you can't get them from elsewhere. But would I recommend this over something like the Nintendo DS, with a massive back catalogue of games and arguably better games in terms of some of the Mario titles and also some of the older games as well that you used to get with Nintendo? I'm going to try and get my hands on a Nintendo DS to give you guys my overall thoughts and opinions on that console, and we can, if you want, do a comparison between the two. If you guys have got any questions about the PS Vita, or if you guys can recommend any games to me, then be sure to hit me up on Twitter, Google+, or leave them in the comments section down below, and we'll be sure to reply to as many as possible. I'd really want some really good games to play, so if you can recommend any, that would be great. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to get some more great content from Copper vs Glass, hit the subscribe button below this video. I'm Michael from Copper vs Glass, thanks very much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next video.